If you were to invite me to dinner, you might ask this question, what would you like? All right, I'm a Baptist preacher, fried chicken always works. I don't have the nickname Chicken Man for no reason. So, I mean, yeah, it's like, but it would be completely different if you said, hey, I'd like you over for dinner, but I want you to really think about what you want because it will be your last meal. My first thought is, why am I having my last meal at your house? But let me think, what would I have? When we hear last meal, what we think is criminal, accused, properly convicted in a court of law, has been sentenced to death as a justified punishment for what they have done, and that punishment is about to be carried out, and so they are allowed to eat one final meal of their choice. So what would it be? I know what mine would be. I don't got to think about it. I'm going to give you some a little bit, give you a little chance because some of you need to think for a minute. I know what mine would be. No doubt about it. Barbecue pork ribs, fried okra, corn on the cob, sweet tea, and banana pudding. I don't got to think about it. Matter of fact, I don't just want that for my last meal. I'd take that for every meal. But I would be dead if I ate like that. It's like your last meal. So in Zephaniah chapter 1, God invites his people to a meal, to a sacrifice. And then basically what he says is, this is your last meal because judgment is coming. And so we turn to Zephaniah 1. I want us to look at this dinner that God is inviting them to and the reasons that it's their last meal. So Zephaniah, if you're not sure what that is, it's Z-E-P on your phone if you download a Bible text. Zephaniah chapter 1, starting in verse 7. Be silent before the Lord God, for the day of the Lord is near. The Lord has prepared a sacrifice and consecrated his guests. And on the day of the Lord's sacrifice, I will punish the officials and the king's sons and all who array themselves in foreign attire. On that day, I will punish everyone who leaps over the threshold and those who fill their master's house with violence and fraud. On that day, declares the Lord, a cry will be heard from the fish gate, a wail from the second quarter, a loud crash from the hills. Wail, O inhabitants of the mortar, for all the traders are no more. All who weigh out silver are cut off. At that time, I will search Jerusalem with lamps. I will punish the men who are complacent, those who say in their hearts, the Lord will not do good, nor will he do ill. Their goods shall be plundered, and their houses laid waste. Though they build houses, they will not inherit them. Though they plant vineyards, they shall not drink wine from them. Now, he starts off with this statement, be silent before the Lord. By my count, you can take all the places we're commanded to be silent in the Bible, and they'll fit on one hand. What's even more interesting is that other than one of those, all of them are connected to the judgment of God. So if you're one of those people who say, hey, you know what, we really need to be quiet and somber in church, what you're saying is, I believe that every Sunday we need to show up for the judgment of God. Please sit on the other side of the building from me. I would rather show up to celebrate that our judgment has been met in Jesus Christ. And so they're told to be silent because this is the judgment of God is about to come. And it's so awe-inspiring and shocking that they're told to be silent because this day of the Lord is near. So he's prepared a sacrifice, consecrate his guests. He's asked them to come. And so why is this thing going to be their last meal? What is it that they have done that would cause God to want to bring judgment on them? Well, the first thing is that they have desired to live in a way that it's acceptable to the nations around them. And on the day of the Lord's sacrifice, it says in verse 8, I will punish the officials and the king's sons. So the king's sons are part of the royal house, and the officials are the people that work in the royal house. So to put it in our context, judgment will begin at Washington, D.C. Some of you are like, yes, let's be silent and bring it on. But in the Bible, the religious officials were also connected with the government officials. They were all headquartered in Jerusalem. And so there was not a division like we have in the United States. And so this is a punishment on all of them, all the people that should have been in charge and leading the country, both in terms of government and in terms of the religious leaders. And then he describes them this way, all who array themselves in foreign attire. So what he's saying is, look, I don't want you to be like the nations around you. So the application, obviously, for Christians is that you and I are not supposed to wear clothes that are in style, because that's what the world does. No, that is not what it means. Even though I've met a few people over the years who lived that way. They were always dressed out of style, but I don't think that was because of a biblical conviction. So what does it mean to array themselves in foreign attire? Well, this is just a picture of what was really going on, and that is a desire to be like the nations around them. And the reality is, if we are going to be followers of Jesus Christ, we are going to encounter people who don't have the same set of values that we do. They don't have the same worldview that we do. They don't have the same priorities that we do. They don't have the same morals that we do. They don't have the same ethics that we do. And when they come into conflict, there's going to be a temptation for us to wear foreign attire, to give in to their values rather than ours. The followers of Jesus are going to stick by God's standards. So let me give you an example of what this looks like. In 1994, in Winterset, Iowa, there was a farmer named Aaron Howell and his wife, Lola. They had been approached numerous times by Warner Brothers to rent out their house because it had a beautiful porch wrapped all the way around the building, set up on a hill, very idyllic, very, very much like what Warner Brothers wanted for a movie they were shooting based on a book, The Bridges of Madison County. If you're not familiar, it's about a lady that has an affair with a photographer. Well, the Howells refused, even though Warner Brothers came back several times. And this is what Aaron Howell said. He said, "I've never been in favor of adultery." I like this guy. "There's never been any in this house, and there never will." I'm thinking his wife likes that. He went on to say, "I told them I wouldn't stand for any hanky-panky. I think they thought they'd wear me down in time, but they didn't know how strongly I feel. There is a constant attempt to wear us down, to compromise our values." And what's happened in Judah is that they've compromised their values. So it's not about the fact they're actually wearing the clothes, but that represents that they've bought into all of the ideals and morals and principles and everything of the nations around them. And they have been explicitly warned numerous times by God not to do that. So that's the first reason for the judgment coming, this last meal. The second reason is because their economic success and the way it was achieved. "On that day, I'll punish everyone who leaps over the threshold." What in the world does that mean? Why does God punish people for jump over the threshold? Now, if you have a study Bible that has notes at the bottom, I want you to be aware that is not a part of your Bible. Your Bible is everything above the line. We're thankful that someone puts some notes down there because, let's be honest, some parts of the Bible are really difficult to understand. Okay, apparently y'all got it all together. I don't even know why I'm up here talking. Like, I understand it all, no problem. Hey, that makes perfect, all of it makes sense to me. I mean, there are parts that are difficult. And so someone, usually a team of people, have put together some footnotes to try to help us to understand. But remember, they're just there to help, and sometimes they're not correct. The Bible is never incorrect. But sometimes notes at the bottom, and so if you may have notes to give you several ideas, some think this comes from 1 Samuel 5, where Dagon falls over before the ark, and so ever after that the Philistines jump over the threshold, and some think it's in a hurry to commit punishment. I found about half a dozen different ways it's been interpreted, but probably the idea is connected with the second half verse, "Those who fill their master's house of violence and fraud." In other words, here's what's going on. Some ridiculous religious practice they had, they borrowed from some other nation. They are very careful to observe that. They leap over the threshold every time. But they've ignored what really matters to God, and that is not doing violence and fraud. And so they fill their houses with violence and fraud. Now, I'll be honest with you, every time I read leap over the threshold, I'm thinking, do you know how hard that would be with groceries? Like, the real problem here is they're doing these foreign weird things like leaping over the threshold, and yet they ignored the things that really matter to God. So verse 10, "On that day declares the Lord, a cry will be heard from the fish gate, a wail from the second quarter, a loud crash from the hills, wail, O inhabitants of Mordor." Now, where in the world are all these places? We don't know. It is assumed that the fish gate in Zephaniah's day was on the north side of the city of Jerusalem, but we're not certain, and we don't know where any of the others are at all. But why is it called the fish gate? Because this is where they would bring the fish and they would sell them. So the fish gates where you'd sell fish. So at the sheep gate, what would they do? Y'all sound like you're not sure. Okay, they're going to sell fish at the fish gate. We're going to do what at the sheep gate? Sell sheep. Now at the dung gate, fertilizer? Actually, it's called the dung gate because they would carry all the trash out through that gate. And so they didn't sell anything there. They just took the trash out through the dung gate. So they had all these different gates that were named for different reasons and purposes. So these are all places. The fish gate we know for certain in the second quarter and the hills and the border, all apparently places where business was conducted. They would buy and sell things. And also it says in the middle of verse 11, all the traders are no more. The traders. It's interesting. The Hebrew word translated traders is the word Canaanite. These are the Canaanites. Now the reason is because Canaanites were traders. You couldn't go anywhere in the ancient world between the continent of Africa and Europe and Asia without going through Israel. You couldn't cross the desert. And the Mediterranean, they stayed right along the coast. So that's where you went. Now, if you have people constantly going through there, you're going to be trading with them as they pass through. All right, let me see if I can help you understand this whole pass-through thing. If you want to know what this looked like, go to Tucumcari, New Mexico. Tucumcari exists for one reason. There's nothing else. And it's too far. So if you're on the northern route on I-40, you need a place to stop, Tucumcari. It has three things: gas stations, motels, and restaurants. If you don't want to take that route, you want to take I-10, you want to go the southern route, well, stop in Van Horn, Texas. It exists for the exact same reason. 75 miles of absolutely nothing, and then there's Van Horn. There are three things in Van Horn. Yes, gas stations, motels, and restaurants. These are places that exist and make a living economically off people that are passing through on the interstate. And so Israel, Judah, they were much like that. You couldn't travel between Egypt or any of these places without going through. And so Canaanite became a word to mean somebody that traded as different folks were passing through, and they've made good money at this. So they're all gone now, all the traders. There's no one conducting business anymore. All who weigh out the silvers, they would measure it out, are cut off. So let's clarify a couple things here. First of all, the problem is not wealth. I have figured out, after enough years, that there are rich people and poor people that have a wealth problem. There are some rich people that think, I've got it made because I'm wealthy. There are plenty of poor people who think, I'll have it made if I can become wealthy. The reality is, whether you're rich or poor, the only way to have it made is to have a relationship with Jesus Christ. And so the problem is not whether or not they had wealth, it was the way that they had attained it. Because that's how he sets the whole stage in verse 9. They have filled their master's house with violence and fraud. They have done it unethically. They have had unbalanced scales, and they've cheated people and swindled people and used people to advance themselves economically. That's why they have filled the master's house with violence and fraud. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Well, but the Bible was written so long ago. Zephaniah was really written a long time ago, like 2,600 years ago. So, I mean, you know, we don't have unethical businesses anymore. Man, the Bible's always relevant. And so the problem, again, was not wealth. It was the fact that their attitude. And the problem is unethical businesses don't just affect the people who conduct themselves unethically. Many innocent people are harmed by unethical businesses. And probably the biggest unethical business practice in my lifetime to this point was Enron. Enron was one of the largest companies in America. They were an energy and power company, and they were finally exposed for a whole host of unethical behaviors. As a matter of fact, at its height, Enron stock was trading at over $200 a share. The day they filed for bankruptcy, they were selling at 29 cents per share. They had accumulated this wealth by a number of unethical business practices, And not only them, but their accounting firm, Arthur Anderson, was involved. And they also filed for bankruptcy and then a few years later reorganized as a holding company. And, the executives for both Arthur Anderson and Enron were convicted of conspiracy, insider trading, securities fraud, and basically what was happening was they were using an accounting method and abusing it by giving value not as to what something was worth, but what they projected it could be worth. And then investing and borrowing against that until it all came down. Now, it wouldn't be that big a deal if the executives who went to prison were all the ones that got harmed, but the reality is there were a lot of retirement funds that were significantly impacted. People's personal savings wiped out or harmed because of this. In other words, the unethical behavior of the executives at Enron didn't just affect them. It affected thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of people. Employees and investors. You see, when you conduct unethical practices, it doesn't just affect you, it affects lots of people. And the problem in Israel is not that they did business, and it's not that they were successful. The problem is that they did it unethically and immorally. And whether it's Zephaniah's day or our day, God does not approve of unethical or immoral behavior. Hello? He does not, and particularly when innocent people are harmed. So they've tried to be like the nations around them, and that's probably why they've done all this, because that's what the nations do. And then maybe the biggest issue here is that they become complacent in their relationship with God and think everything is okay when it's not. Verse 12, at that time I will search Jerusalem with lamps. Jerusalem with lamps. If the Bible was written today, it wouldn't be worded this way. It would say we searched under the couch, under the dresser, under the refrigerator, under the nightstand, with a flashlight on our phone. So that's what's going on. God says, I'm searching for you. I'm looking for you. At that time, I'll search Jerusalem with lamps, and I will punish the men who are complacent, who say in their hearts, the Lord will not do good, nor will he do ill. Now, if you have I use the English Standard Version. If you have a different translation, instead of the word complacent, it may say men who are sitting on their lees. Well, that clarifies it, doesn't it? So it comes to the winemaking process, and what happens is the solids settle the bottom, and then you pour the wine off. And if you let it sit for a long time, the whole thing will become a moldy mush that's undrinkable. And so you wait until the sediments have settled, then you pour it off. So the settled, that's the complacent. They have settled down on their lees. They're not moving anymore. Okay? This doesn't mean retirement. It means they're complacent. And complacent about what? About what God will do. They say the Lord will not do good, nor will he do ill. In other words, they don't think that God is involved in the world. It's kind of a deistic approach where God's the clockmaker. He winds up the clock and lets everything run, but is no longer involved in his world. And there are people who just kind of live life as though God is not going to do anything. He's not going to be involved at all. Jesus uses this to describe what's going to happen right before his second coming. Matthew 24:38. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark. Now think about this. They were eating and drinking. Nothing wrong with that. That's how we survive. Like there's no sin in eating and drinking. I'm looking around. You don't think it's sinful to eat. And so there's nothing wrong, there's nothing they've done. And they were marrying and giving in marriage. We believe in marriage. In other words, what Jesus is saying is, it's not like everything they're doing is wicked and evil and immoral and all this kind of stuff. The problem is they're just living their life as though God is never going to intervene, as though God is never going to hold them accountable, as though God's not going to do anything. And they were just living this way, and then suddenly it started raining. And it kept raining. And it kept raining. And it kept raining for 40 days and 40 nights. In other words, they just didn't think God would do good or ill, that God just won't do, well, anything. And so that's why they become complacent, because they think they can live like the nations around them, they can do all kinds of unethical things, and God won't punish them or anything. But look what's going to happen in verse 13. Their goods will be plundered, their houses laid waste. Though they build houses, they will not inhabit them. Though they plant vineyards, they shall not drink wine from them. Now, these words are chosen for a very specific reason, because they go all the way back to the days of Moses. They've come out of Egypt, spent 40 years in the desert. Now they're about to enter into the land. And Moses gives them this warning in Deuteronomy chapter 6. And when the Lord your God brings you into the land that he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give you, with great and good cities that you did not build, houses full of all good things that you did not fill, cisterns that you did not dig, and vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant. And when you eat and are full, then take care lest you forget the Lord, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. It is the Lord your God you shall fear. Him you shall serve, and by his name you shall swear. You will not go after other gods, the gods of the peoples who are around you, or wear their clothing. For the Lord your God is in your midst, is a jealous God, lest the anger of the Lord your God be kindled against you, and he destroy you from off the face of the earth. In other words, God says, be careful when I bless you with lots of stuff that you forget me. One of my professors used to say this, usually for Christians, we can handle the tough times, it's the good times we struggle with. The reason is because when things are tough, we just instinctively pray. We lean on God. We depend on God. We cry out desperately to God. And I know this to be true. So, well, Paul, how do you know it's true? Well, I've been a pastor for over 3.5 decades. And all those years, never had anybody call church office. Say, I'd like to put a request on the prayer chain, please. Yes? Yep, things are going great. I want our church to pray for me that I would not forget God. Like, it's really easy. When you're desperate, you have nowhere to go but God. And you pray, and you want to get everybody you know to pray. I mean, it makes sense. And so what God has warned them is, man, when I give you all this, so this taking away the houses that you build, not inhabit, plant, that all goes back to God says, I warned you, and I warned you, and I warned you. Don't think that you are invincible just because you're my people. Judgment comes. I'm stunned sometimes at people that somehow think the United States can't fall. God raises nations at his discretion, and he brings them down at his discretion. And I think God has blessed our country the way he has because we have been so good at giving it away to those in need and using it to send missionaries around our world to spread the good news of Jesus around the world. But I'm telling you, if we decide we're going to spend it all on ourselves instead, God will take it away and give it to somebody that'll use it to spread his message. And so, don't think that it can't happen. The invincible can be defeated. King Philip of Spain wanted to force England to reestablish Catholicism as the official religion. He also wanted to end English piracy. So he decided he would use 30,000 Spanish troops that were war veterans who are currently in the Netherlands under the leadership of the Duke of Parma to invade England. He planned on using the Spanish fleet to defeat or deter the English fleet so that 30,000 soldiers could get across the English Channel and invade England. This fleet of Spanish ships was known as the Invincible Spanish Armada. They sailed from Lisbon in May of 1588 under the command of Duke Medina Sidonia. Their fleet consists of about 130 ships, over 40 of which were line of battle ships. They were first line ships. There were about 8,000 sailors and around 19,000 soldiers. The English fleet was under the command of Charles Howard, the second Baron Howard of Effingham, and his second in command was Sir Francis Drake. The English fleet was less than 100 ships, and only about 2.5 dozen were warships of the first rank. However, the English ships were very well armed for their size. Matter of fact, the English placed great reliance on artillery. So their ships had fewer soldiers, but more and heavier guns than the Spanish ships. The first sighting of the English fleet was off Lizard Point in Cornwall on July 29th of 1588. Most of the English fleet was actually currently anchored at Plymouth, but when they got wind of what was coming, that's a play on words. They got wind of coming, they embarked, and they were able to get the windward or the upwind side of the enemy. So the west of their armada having both the wind and the tide in their favor. That meant that they had a tactical advantage. In 3 encounters between the British fleet and the Invincible Spanish Armada, one off Plymouth on July 31st, one off Portland Bill on August the 2nd, and one off the Isle of Wight on August the 4th, the English harassed the Spanish fleet at long range and avoided all Spanish attempts to get close to inflict damage. The Armada, the Invincible Spanish Armada, reached the Strait of Dover on August the 6th. And they anchored in an exposed position off of Calais, France. The English also anchored still to the west, so they were on the windward side and the favorable tide side. And they had been reinforced by a squadron that had been guarding the narrow seas. News reached Parma that there had been this encounter, and so he began to put his soldiers onto transports to cross to England, but it took 6 days. And during those 6 days, the Invincible Spanish Armada had no safe port. So they're just basically anchored out in the strait. At midnight on August the 7th and into the early hours of the 8th in 1588, the English launched 8 fire ships floating on the tide and with the wind behind them to float into the Spanish fleet. That forced the Spanish to cut the cables, losing their anchors, and to stand out to sea to avoid catching fire. Their formation was thus completely broken, and at dawn on the 8th of August 1588, the English attacked the disorganized Invincible Spanish fleet off of Gravelines. A decisive battle was had. The English ships now closed to effective range. The Spanish ships sustained serious damage and casualties without being able to effectively reply. 3 Spanish ships were sunk, and most of the others were badly battered. Both the west wind and the English fleet now prevented the Armada from protecting Parma and his troops that were crossing over to invade England, and they were forced to return to Spain. The long voyage home through the autumn gales of the North Atlantic inflicted further damage. By the time they reached port, only about 60 ships survived. Most of them were too badly damaged to be repaired and had to be scuttled. There were as many as 15,000 men who had perished. The English lost only a few hundred, no ships, and most of the English men who died to disease rather than any damage or injury sustained in the battle. The defeat of the Invincible Spanish Armada saved England from invasion and the Dutch Republic from extinction, while dealing a heavy blow to the prestige of the greatest European power of the age. They thought they were invincible, but they were not. Don't ever think that we are invincible. We are not. The judgment of God can come when He decides that it will come. So what should we do in light of the fact that judgment could come? That there could be an economic collapse, that the world could be turned upside down, buy lots of guns and ammo and become a survivalist. Now, I'm all down with the buy guns and ammo. If you're asking how many guns is enough, one more. So, I tell you, but the reality is, I don't care how much you arm yourself, I don't care how big a hole you dig in the ground and what you stock it with and store it with. The reality is, when God's judgment comes, you can't escape it. I believe in being prepared for the future and self-defense and all that stuff. It's in the Bible. But the reality is, ultimately, you and I need to spend our lives living for Jesus Christ. But there's something interesting in this passage that I want to make sure we grasp. God is not talking about what's going on with the Babylonians, or what's going on with the Moabites, or the Amorites, or the Hittites, or the Perizzites, or the Girgashites. Always my favorite name. Girgashites. Sounds like mouthwash. Like God's not talking about it. But here's what oftentimes happens with Christians. We think the judgment of God is coming because of what they are doing. Let me help you a little bit here. Do you know how unrighteous people behave? I got 5 people that said unrighteously. How do unrighteous people behave? Like unrighteous people. I don't know why we're shocked that lost people act like lost people. Non-believers act like non-believers. We're like, man, I can't believe that non-Christians don't act like Christians. I can. They're non-Christians. The judgment of God in this passage and in many places in the Bible is not because of what they are doing out there, but because of us. Sodom and Gomorrah were not destroyed because of unrighteousness. They were destroyed because of a lack of righteousness. Abraham only had to come up with 10. The cities would have been spared. The call in this passage is to the people of God to walk with God. The challenge for you and me is that we would walk with Jesus Christ. That we would follow Him and live for Him. In other words, that we're going to swim upstream to what the world is doing. Now, let me warn us. This doesn't mean we point our finger and yell at people about how bad they are. This means we show them the love and the mercy and the grace and the compassion of Jesus Christ. We should expect them to live like that, so don't yell at them about it. Instead, let them see there's a better way. And that's the way of living for Jesus Christ. Now, hear me well. I believe the best way to live life is to live it for Jesus, but I don't believe it's the easiest way to live. So I'm not going to say, hey man, come to Jesus and everything will be wonderful. But I'm convinced it is the best way to live, is to live for Jesus Christ. And the call in this passage was for them to live like the people of God. Not to point fingers at what's going on out there, but instead to live for the God that they know. The problem is that the people of God are living like the people that don't belong to God. And the challenge for you and me is that we live like people that belong to Jesus. We don't live like people who don't belong to Jesus. That's the call in this passage. That's what he's saying. And the problem is they've been wearing the wrong clothes. The foreign attire. And it's not about the clothing. It is about the attitude and the worldview and their approach and what's important and what's right and what's wrong. Here's what I'm telling you. When people look at you and ask, why do you live like that? Your answer is, because Jesus has made a difference in my life. Why don't you cheat at business? Because Jesus is in charge of my life. Why are you honest? Because Jesus is in charge of my life. That's what we want them to see, is the light of Jesus Christ in their world of darkness. Because we want them to come to Jesus Christ and experience His forgiveness and this great life of living for Him. Our Heavenly Father, it's kind of scary to think that you would invite your people to dinner and say, this isn't for fellowship, but this is your last meal, because judgment is coming. So God, I pray that it would be a warning to us as it was intended to be a warning to them, that we would not adopt the standards of the pagans, the standard of those that are all around them and are all around us, but that we live by your standards, even when it's difficult, even when there are forces always tugging at us and pulling at us to adopt different standards, different morals and different ethics, different ideals. God, help us to stay true and faithful to you. For it is in Jesus' name we ask it.